Today we're going to do section 4.8, which is on the quadratic formula and discriminant. Discriminant. The actual discriminant is a formula, and it's b squared minus 4ac. Now, if you think about that, that's what's underneath the square root in the quadratic formula. Now, you could go ahead and just do that, and that could tell you the number and type of solutions that you're going to have. It's not going to give you these solutions, but it can tell you a lot of things. It can tell you the number and the type of solutions. So think about if you have underneath the square root, if the underneath the square root is greater than 0, we end up with two real solutions. Because what's underneath the square root is positive, so you're not going to have an imaginary number, but you're going to have two real solutions because of the plus or minus that's in front of it in the quadratic formula. Now, if what's underneath the square root equals 0, basically that gets rid of the plus or minus. So you're only going to have one real solution in a problem like that. And then if you have less than 0 underneath the square root, you're still going to have the plus or minus, but you're also going to have a negative inside the square root, so it becomes two imaginary solutions. Okay? So let's go ahead. We're going to find the discriminant first. So for this first problem, a is 1, b is -4, and c is 10. Now I'm going to find b squared, okay, so that's going to be -4. Remember to keep that in parentheses. -4 squared minus 4 times 1 times 10, okay? That's going to be 16 minus 40, which is -24, okay? That is the discriminant. Now, because it's negative, that tells me if I were to work this out, I would have two imaginary solutions. Okay? So there's my two answers. -24 is the discriminant. Two imaginary solutions is the number and type of solutions we would have. Next problem, a is 64. B is -16, C is 1, okay? B squared, I'd take -16 squared minus 4 times 64 times 1, okay? Now if I work this out, if I take -16 squared, that would be 256, okay, and then 4 times 64 is also 256, and you multiply that times 1, it's still 256. So the discriminant this time is 0. So underneath the square root, I would have 0. That basically gets rid of the plus or minus in the quadratic formula, which means that I only end up with one real solution. Okay? So there's the discriminant, there's the discriminant, and the type and number of solutions. Last one, again, we want to make sure that we have this in standard form. So I'm going to add the 3x, and I'm going to subtract the 3 to bring everything over to the right side. So 4x squared plus 6x minus 15 equals 0. Okay? A is 4, B is 6, C is 15, -15 to be exact. So now when I do this math, it's going to be 6 squared minus 4 times 4 times -15. Okay, that's going to be 36. Now these two negatives end up being plus, and that's going to multiply out to be 240. Now when I do the math, that's going to be 276. Okay, there's my discriminant. Now because it's positive, if I had a positive number underneath the square root, I'd have plus or minus, so there'd be two solutions, and these are going to be real because what's underneath the square root is positive. So it's going to be two real solutions. Now, from here on out, you actually have 4 different ways to solve equations. So if they ask you to solve the equation using any method, you get to choose. You can factor, you can find square roots to solve, you can complete the square like we did in 4.7, or you could do the quadratic formula like we just learned. Now let's talk about modeling launched objects. If an object is dropped, you have that first equation. If an object is launched or thrown, you have that second equation, and they're just a little bit different just because of the launching. Now, you need to plug in, if you have h, that's going to be your height in feet. Okay? It's always in feet unless otherwise specified. T is the time that it's in motion, which is always typically going to be seconds unless the problem says otherwise. H sub 0 is the initial height. Okay, that's where the height actually starts. And then V sub 0 is the initial vertical velocity, the vertical velocity right at the beginning. Now let's do a problem. Okay, so the first thing you have to decide is which equation are we going to use. We're going to use this equation when the object is launched or thrown, okay, because the juggler is tossing the ball into the air. Okay, now let's think about, do we know what the height is at the end? Okay, they said the juggler catches the ball when it falls back to a height of 3 feet. So that's going to be the feet at the end, or the height at the end. Okay, so I had that to plug in. Then we have negative 16. T squared is what I'm looking for. I'm looking for t. How long is it in the air? T is the time. Okay. And then we have an initial vertical velocity of 40 feet per second. So it's going to be plus 40t. V sub 0 is your initial vertical velocity. Still looking for t. And then the initial height is 4. Okay, because they said right here, he tossed it at 4 feet above the ground. So there's our equation. Now we need to solve for t. I'm going to subtract 3 from both sides. So I've got 0 equals negative 16 t squared plus 40t plus 1. Okay? Now I'm just going to go ahead and use the quadratic formula to solve. I've got a is negative 16, b is 40, and c is 1. So now when I go to plug in, okay, I'm going to have t equals the opposite of b, so negative 40, plus or minus the square root of 40 squared minus 4 times negative 16 times 1. Okay, we'll finish that square root. All over 2 times negative 16. Okay, and then we continue with the math. Negative 40 plus or minus the square root of 1600. That's going to be plus 64 all over negative 32. Okay, and we continue. So I'm going to end up with negative 40 plus or minus the square root of 1664 all over negative 32. Now, in this situation, it is okay for us to actually use some decimals, okay? Because this is a word problem and we need to find out actual time, I'm going to go ahead and figure out what this square root is, okay? So we've got 1664. Take the square root. You're going to have plus or minus, this is about 40.792, and that's going to be all over negative 32. Okay? We need to think about signs. If I take negative 40 plus 40.792, that's going to give me 0.792 over negative 32. Now, before I even worry about doing the math for that, that's going to be a negative answer. I'm not going to have a negative time. So that one's out right now, okay? Now, if I do the negative, it's going to be negative 40 minus 40.792 over negative 32. If I do that math, it's going to be negative 80 0.792 over negative 32. Now, that's going to be okay because I'm going to end up with a positive answer, okay? So now if I divide that by negative 32, I'm going to end up with about 2.525 seconds, okay? And if you keep some of those decimals in your calculator before you round off, this is going to give you a little bit more exact number. And that's what I did on my calculator. I kept it. I rounded off to 0.792, but I also kept it in my calculators where it wasn't rounded off. So I've got a more exact answer at 2.525 seconds. Okay? Now, that's going to conclude section 4.8.